I want to begin the way that we began the last 2 times I've been here. I want to pray a very short prayer where I say, the Lord be with you. And I would like for you to respond by saying, and also with you. Because even though there's lights up here and all the actions happening up here, we need the Lord working amongst you and amongst me this morning. So, friends, the Lord be with you. Thank you. We're going to read from Luke chapter 5. If you've got a Bible, you bring it with you. It's going to go up on the screen. We're not going to get to it right away. We're going to read through the first 11 verses interspersed throughout the message. So I just want to give you a heads up so that you can open it up for yourself right now. But the words will show up on the screen as we roll along. About 10 years ago, while you're looking for that, I was introduced to this phrase, limiting beliefs. Limiting beliefs are the traits, the characteristics, or the details about yourself that you believe disqualify you from chasing after some goal or dream or accomplishment. It's a belief you have that limits your progress in any area of life. And sometimes your limiting beliefs are true. I'm probably not going to dunk a basketball. But sometimes your limiting beliefs are false. And whether they're true or false is kind of irrelevant. They always limit you from chasing after some goal or accomplishment or dream. For example, I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and I told her I could never run a marathon. You know, I don't have the lung capacity. I don't have the leg muscles. I just don't have the stamina. I'd die. And there's a mix of true and false beliefs in that, right? True, I don't currently have the lung capacity or the stamina, but it's false. I probably could run it, and I probably wouldn't die, right? Either way, the belief limits me from chasing after that goal. And now that we're all on the same page about, what a limiting belief is, you're going to start to hear them if you don't already. You're going to hear them everywhere. We all have these. I could never be an artist. I'm not creative enough. I could never be a good parent. I'm not responsible enough. I could never get a steady job. Nobody's going to hire me. I could never buy a house, not in this economy. I could never change careers. I could never go to grad school. I could never pay off debt. I could never talk in front of that many people. I could never get up that early. I'm not a morning person. I could never shop there. I could never look like that. I could never join that exercise group or follow that plan. And let's be honest, sometimes limiting beliefs are pretty much inconsequential, right? You have them, I have them, but they don't really matter that much. For example, me saying, I could never run a marathon. I don't really want to run a marathon, so it doesn't matter. But when it really matters is when your limiting beliefs keep you from becoming the person that you deeply desire to be. I could never be that disciplined. I'm going to be stuck in this emotional state forever. I could never repair that relationship. I don't think my marriage is going to ever change. I can never talk to my parents about that issue or that topic, or I could never. I'll never have the courage to stand up for myself like that. Our lives are filled with these limiting beliefs, things that we believe about ourselves that limit not just what we can accomplish or what we could gain or get, but that limit who we can become. Now, as a pastor, one of the limiting beliefs that I hear the most often revolves around people's relationship with God. It's easy for a whole bunch of different reasons to have limiting beliefs about ourselves or others that keep us or others disconnected or disqualified from a relationship with God. God's not interested in people like me or people like them. Certainly not interested in those of us who aren't all that interested in God, right? And this morning, I want to address that limiting belief, that God's not interested in people like me or people like them, people who aren't super spiritual, people who just aren't really all that religious, or people who aren't pious enough. I mean, some people have gifts, right? Some people are good at talking from a stage with a microphone strapped to their face. Some people are really good at music, right? Some people are good at praying. Some people are just more spiritual, and maybe God's interested in those people, but God's not interested in people like me. In order to get at this limiting belief and address it this morning, we're going to read from Luke chapter 5, and we're going to read about the calling of a disciple named Simon Peter. The reason that I chose to talk about this morning is because you all are going to be starting a new series on discipleship with Justin and Britton in the next coming weeks. And so I thought this would be a good primer, a good place to start. The beginning is usually a good place to start. So we're going to talk about the calling of Simon Peter. Now, if you're new to the New Testament, Simon Peter was one of Jesus' 12 apostles or disciples, but better than that, he was actually one of the main three who got most screen time with Jesus, and he ends up becoming a major leader in the early church. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church today still considers him to be the first pope. He's praised for leaving everything to follow Jesus, as though he was some kind of wonderkind super spiritual hero who immediately recognized the value of who Jesus was, and he left his nets, and he quit his job, and he followed right away. At least if you read his telling of the story, that's how it went. Which, by the way, is what most scholars agree that the Gospel of Mark is, that the Gospel of Mark is probably Peter's telling about the life of Jesus. And if you read Matthew's version, it's nearly word for word the same as Peter's telling, as the Gospel of Mark. And the reason for that is because, the Gospel of Matthew used Mark as for some source material in Matthew's writing. But if you read Luke or you read John, you'll discover there's actually a few more details that are a part of Peter's story when it comes to becoming a disciple of Jesus. Peter actually had a couple of different interactions with Jesus before deciding to go full-time follower. It started when his brother Andrew met Jesus. You see, Andrew was the student of a traveling preacher named John the Baptist. Maybe you've heard of him. And after John the Baptist had been teaching Andrew for a little bit, he pointed out Jesus as the Messiah, the one that everybody was going to be waiting for. And so Andrew switched teams, with John's permission and encouragement, to go become a disciple of Jesus. Now, in Peter's mind, Andrew's the kind of guy God is interested in. Andrew's got a full-time job as a fisherman with him, which took place at night, and then he spent part of his day taking in religious teaching from the rabbi, first John the Baptist, and then Jesus. Jesus inviting Andrew to be a disciple. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And maybe you know people like that in your life, right? They love the Bible study. They love the prayer groups. They love taking up space in coffee shops and little huddles talking about big books about God. They love singing on Sundays. They listen to podcast sermons on Mondays. Their kids are always memorizing Bible verses. They pray before every meal, before every bedtime, before every morning where they go off to work. Maybe you know some Andrews. They're the kind of people God is interested in, right? Maybe you are an Andrew. If so, God bless you. Not everybody's like that, though. So Andrew meets Jesus, and immediately he goes and he grabs his brother, Simon Peter, and he drags him over to meet Jesus too. You can read about this in the beginning of the Gospel of John. And Jesus was really nice to Peter. In that first conversation, he pays Peter a compliment. He says, you're going to be known as Petros. You're going to be known as somebody who's solid like a rock. But that was kind of the end of it, as far as we know. Peter didn't drop his nets and follow Jesus yet after that moment. Not too long after that, Jesus ended up, I'm assuming because Andrew invited him, over to Peter's house. And they're all hanging out together. They're eating lunch. And Peter's mother-in-law wasn't feeling so well. And somehow Jesus miraculously healed her. And very quickly, the word got out. And all kinds of people start showing up to Peter's house. And Jesus co-opts it and turns it into a hospital. And even then, Peter didn't become a full-time follower yet. It wasn't until what we're about to read that day when Jesus was teaching on the beach that things started to change. I mean, he had co-opted his home. Why not co-opt Peter's job too? Our text comes from, like I said, the Gospel of Luke. And we're going to pause for a minute later to talk about why that's really important. But in case you're not familiar, the Gospel of Luke, written by Luke, he was a historian and he was a physician. He was the personal doctor to the Apostle Paul, which is important because the Apostle Paul needed a personal doctor. He was constantly getting pelted with rocks, ran out of town, shipwrecked, beat up. People were always physically abusing the Apostle Paul. He needed his own doctor. Now, Luke was commissioned by a Roman official named Theophilus to put together from eyewitness accounts the life of Jesus and Jesus' teaching. And Luke could do that because he had access to the eyewitnesses through his relationship with the Apostle Paul, who had access to the disciples. And so Luke tells that drop your nets and follow Jesus story with a little more detail than Matthew and Mark. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God, listening to his teaching. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. And then he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. Now, if you read the story quickly and have some of the other stories, like Matthew and Mark's version in your mind, you might think, well, Jesus was giving a TED Talk and then he stepped onto a stranger's boat and commandeered it. No, Jesus knew Peter. They had interacted. They had had lunch together. He's been to his house. They know each other somewhat. The other reason I like this detail, though, by the way, in this story is because it's so real. I mean, have you ever stood by the water's edge and seen a couple guys out in a boat fishing, maybe 100 yards out? If the water's perfectly calm, you can hear their conversation. Calm water is like nature's megaphone. It's really cool. Anyway, Jesus steps in, uses the water as a natural megaphone. And then they push out. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." I just want you to appreciate the humor of this moment. Have you ever had somebody come up to you at your place of work and start telling you how to do your job? I mean, if you're Peter in this moment, what are you thinking? Okay, preacher man, let's look at my hands. Let's look at your hands. See the difference? You see all the calluses on my hands? Because I've been, throwing these nets out into the water, pulling them back in. I've been dragging them, cleaning them, fixing them, throwing them out, pulling them back in. And I've been doing this fishing gig day in and day out. I appreciate you. But you talk to people for a living. Oh, you used to be a carpenter? That's great. What makes you think you can tell me about fishing? We just finished cleaning these things. We just finished repairing them. We've been fishing all night, which is when you fish, by the way, not the middle of the day. We're a little tired. Maybe we're a little irritable. Please don't tell me how to do my job. Anyway, maybe that's what I'm thinking. I don't know. But even if that's not where if that's not where he lands, I think that's kind of how he starts. He starts, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." And then I just, this is a little editorial, but then you just put it in a pause. Okay, but remember all the healings at my house. Because you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. This incredible, miraculous catch of fish drives Peter to his knees. And he speaks what turns out to be one of humanity's deepest limiting beliefs that keeps us disqualified and disconnected from a relationship with God. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. We'll get back to that part, but go away from me, because I am a sinful man, Lord. Go away from me, because I am and the word he uses here is the Greek word hamartolos. You want to say, Justin said you guys like say words. You want to try that? It's hamartolos. I know in our English Bibles it's translated as sinful, right? Or sinner. But here's what I'm guessing is true. I'm going to make an assumption. I shouldn't do that as a speaker. I'm going to give it a shot. We'll see. When I say the word sinner or sinful, something comes to your mind, right? Some kind of activity, some kind of person, something comes to mind when I say the word sin or sinful or sinner. That word's got a ton of cultural baggage with it. And I'm not a magician, not a mind reader, but I will confidently say that 99% of the time, what you are thinking of is not what this word means. Whatever it is that you're thinking, it's not it. The word hamartolos has with it the image of aiming for a target and missing. Hamartolos is to miss the mark. Imagine trying to aim for a target. Imagine drawing back the bow and trying to hit it. You fall short. You over to the side, over the top. You miss the mark. That's what this word means. In other words, Peter says, Jesus, you don't want me to be part of your thing. I don't belong in your orbit. You're not interested in someone like me. I'm not a religion guy. I'm not a super spiritual person. I'm not a pious person. I'm not a church person. I miss the mark in life. He doesn't even specify an area. He just says, in general, man, I'm just to miss the mark as a human. Nothing specific. I regularly miss the mark on what it means to be a husband, on what it means to be a son, on a father. I miss the mark on what it means to be a brother. Just ask Andrew. I miss the mark on being a homeowner, a career guy. I miss the mark on being an entrepreneur, on my education. That's why I'm a fisherman. I miss the mark all of the time in life. You don't want someone like me. I'm just an ordinary guy who falls short. You want guys like my brother Andrew, people who are excited about being religious. I mean, even though he was fishing with us last night, he still followed you today. You want people like that, not people like me. I'm not the droid you're looking for. But what Peter didn't realize is something I often forget. And maybe you do too. But hear me, this is central to the way of Jesus. What Peter didn't realize is that his admitting to being a hamartolos man was his admission into Jesus' orbit. His admitting to I missed the mark in life was his admission into a real relationship with Jesus. And Jesus said, don't be afraid. I'll teach you. I'll teach you to fish for people. You've spent your whole life pretty sure you know about the ways of fish. Oh, you can't catch them you only catch them at night. You can't catch them during the day. You're pretty sure also that you know the ways of God, about who God's interested in, about who God's love is for, about who God's grace can cover, about who is invited and who is welcomed by God and who isn't. But I want people to know what God is really like. I want people to know what the kingdom of heaven can really be like. I want you to know what your life can really be like. And in order to reach ordinary, everyday, miss the mark people, I need ordinary, everyday, miss-the-mark disciples. I need you. You think because you're not super spiritual or you're not pious or you're not a religious person, you think because you fall short that it disqualifies you from God's interest? Even if you're not interested in God, God is interested in you. Peter, follow me. And he did. He dropped his nets, left the boats, he left everything. And he followed Jesus. Matthew said it. Mark said it. The question that I kept pondering while I was prepping for this morning, this past week, was, why didn't Luke just say that? Why didn't he just say what the other guys said? Why did he tell this part of the story, the hamartolos admission? Well, what you need to understand about Matthew and Mark's Gospels is that they were primarily written for mostly Jewish Christian audiences. People who already understood themselves as the people of God. These are people who already kind of understood themselves as being in, you know? They've got a whole history. They've got an entire book filled with stories about a pre-existing relationship with God. They've got all kinds of rules and precepts and instructions for how to relate to that God. But not everyone's like that. Not everyone has that. Maybe people like Theophilus, who grew up outside of the Jewish community, didn't have that. And so you'll notice, if you read through the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts, by the way, which is also written by Luke for Theophilus, you'll notice that Luke goes out of his way to make sure that Theophilus, the original readers, and you and me, he goes out of his way to make sure that we know that Jesus came for hamartolos people, that Jesus came for outsiders, that Jesus came for marginalized, that Jesus came for the poor, that Jesus came for the sinners and the tax collectors and those that needed the great physician. Jesus was interested in the people that were pretty sure God wasn't interested in them. Luke wants to make sure that Theophilus knows, and that you know, that even the heroes of the early church didn't start that way. And to be honest with you, when Peter started, he had no idea where any of this was going to go. If you think about that for a minute. He had no idea that he was about to follow Jesus up to a mountaintop where he was going to literally peer into heaven. He had no idea that he was going to follow Jesus around and see the blind have their sight restored, the sick be healed, the paralyzed be able to walk. He also had no idea that he was going to do those kinds of miracles and more. He had no idea he was going to see Jesus calm a storm on the sea, walk on water, and then invite him to do the same. He also had no idea that he was going to stand up at a dinner with Jesus and some of his closest companions and profess to all of them that he would follow Jesus to death. And then a few hours later, not be able to admit to a middle school girl that he knew Jesus, and then would repeatedly deny that he didn't even care whether Jesus lived or died, and he totally abandoned Jesus in what you could call his hour of greatest need. He had no idea that he would have to stand at a distance and watch as Jesus was brutally murdered without him ever getting a chance to say sorry. He also had no idea that he would then have to go into hiding for 3 days until a few of his female friends would come to him on a Sunday morning and tell him that Jesus had risen from the dead. And he certainly had no idea that he would then sit on a beach and have breakfast with that same Jesus who would look at him across the fire and forgive him for the abandonment that took place just days earlier. He had no idea that that experience of forgiveness and grace would drive and compel him to share that message of the forgiveness of sins and the hope of the kingdom of God, which is basically the idea of a world made right, about heaven crashing into earth, about all things being made new. He had no idea that that experience would drive him to share that message with everyone, anyone, even when it meant abandoning some of his most core religious principles that he used to hold dear, like not entering the house of a non-Jewish person, not just going into their house, but like eating with them, baptizing them, sharing the gospel with them, inviting them into the same community of faith that at one point he himself did not even think he was worthy of. He had no idea that he would write or dictate 2 letters while he was in hiding, which were then, written down, copied by friends, written to encourage Christians who were living persecuted throughout the Roman Empire. Letters that would become so valued, so treasured, so helpful that they were read ubiquitously for 300 years and then included in what you and I call the New Testament. All he knew in that moment was that he was a hamartolos. And admitting that was his admission into the community of Jesus, a community that would not just reshape his life, but let's be honest, it would reshape the world. It's kind of the reason you and I are here this morning, right? Friends, this is the heart of the Christian faith. Christianity is not a religion in which, those of us who call ourselves Christians think that we are better than everybody else. Following Jesus begins by admitting that you're not, that you missed the mark in your relationships, your work, your spirituality, your moral integrity, in your parenting. I missed the mark in life. But that's not the disqualifier that disconnects you from God. It is the distinct starting point. The good news of Jesus is that God loved you where you are, how you are, so much that he thought you were worth dying for. God has forgiven your faults. And like Peter, he's inviting you into a new life. And listen, maybe you don't need to completely leave your boats and nets in order to go live it. Jesus co-opted Peter's home. He co-opted Peter's job. He took him to places he never imagined possible. And I'll be honest, I think maybe he's inviting us to do the same today. What would it look like for you to let Jesus co-opt your home? What would it look like for you to let Jesus co-opt your place of work and turn them into places where you show people what God is really like? Where you show your kids, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, the unfathomable, across the fire, breakfast on a beach forgiveness that Jesus put on display for Peter and for the world. Now, it's possible that you might think to yourself, well, I hear you, Corey, but I'm not really that good at talking about my faith. I'm not really good with words. I don't know the right words to say, or I don't know enough Bible, or I don't know enough theology, or I'm not religious enough, or I'm not spiritual enough. Listen, those are all limiting beliefs. Jesus says, don't be afraid. I'll teach you. So maybe let go of your nets. See what happens. Follow him. Who knows what your future could hold?